Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our AAA Teen Driver Safety Series. And today we're going to focus on distracted driving, a topic that's obviously relevant for all drivers, not just teens. But of course, old habits die hard. So when teens begin driving, that's probably the most important time to form good, safe habits. And distracted driving is an issue that at AAA we've been working on for decades. And unfortunately, while we've made some progress, we've backslid in other ways, and it remains a very serious threat to public safety, especially for young drivers. And each year, we actually conduct a survey to learn more about driver behaviors and beliefs on traffic safety issues. And just as always, it's a do as I say, not as I do attitude, and that includes distracted driving. A lot of folks admit to distracted driving, texting while driving, talking on a handheld device while driving, and those who do so are more likely to have been involved in a recent crash. So we know it's certainly a danger, and we're going to hear a lot more about that danger and how important it is to teach teens the right habits from two excellent presenters today, Dr. Neil Chaudhary and Karen Torres. And we're going to have each of them give a little bit of a presentation, and then we'll have some questions at the end. And for the audience, feel free to submit questions at any time using that chat box that you might see on your screen. So without further ado, we'll welcome Neil Chaudhary to the webinar. He's the owner and CEO of Preusser Research Group, an organization that's based in Trumbull, Connecticut, maybe 15 miles down the road from me in Hamden. Is one of the top researchers in the field of traffic safety nationwide. He holds a PhD in experimental psychology from City University, New York, CUNY. He is on the Transportation Research Board's committees, Occupant Protection Committee. He's on a number of traffic safety committees locally in Connecticut, and just a great friend to AAA and to the cause of safety. So welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Alec. So can you hear me all right, everybody? Hear me good? Well, okay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about distracted driving in terms of what it is and share a little bit of data that we've collected over the years, discussing how young people differ from more experienced drivers in terms of how they drive distracted. Next slide. So distracted driving isn't actually something that's new. People have been driving distracted for some time now, whether that be eating, shaving, putting on makeup, even smoking. Next slide. But more recently, the focus has moved to handheld mobile devices and how they distract drivers. One thing that's important, next slide, is to note that the new distractions don't necessarily replace the old distractions. They may all be happening simultaneously. In a study we did in Northern Virginia, we showed that 23% of individuals were engaged in some activity other than driving when we viewed them, so this is observational. Same technique in Louisiana, 30% of individuals. And in Louisiana, when we focused on people who were younger, it was 40% of individuals doing something other than the primary task of driving. Next slide, please. All right. So car info, we went a little too fast. Car infotainment systems, there we go, may not actually be better than the portable devices we were talking about, especially for teens who are less experienced. So one of the things that I assumed when I got my first vehicle that had one of these built into it is that the manufacturers wouldn't put it in the vehicle if it weren't distracting. That is not the case, and it's important for young drivers to know that, as well as everybody else, that this activity is distracting, and there's some research suggesting that it's just as distracting as as handheld phones. Next slide, please. So, what is distracted driving? Is talking to a passenger distracting? Texting, I think we can all agree, is a distracting activity. Next slide. So the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has suggested that there's 3 types of distraction. Visual distraction, something that takes your eyes off the road. Manual distraction, something that takes your hands off the wheel. And cognitive distraction, which is something that takes your mind off the primary task of driving. Next slide. So these things combine and at different levels. So talking to a passenger might be slightly distracting. It's mostly taking your mind off the road, unless you're driving with one of those folks that insists on turning and looking at you while they're talking to you. And that always annoys me. You can talk to me and focus on the road. Next slide. Something like glancing at a GPS, and we're talking glancing now, not programming. Programming a GPS is probably the worst thing anybody could do. If you need to program your GPS, please pull over, program it, and get back on the road. This is distracting to those of us who are now expert drivers. Can you imagine what programming a GPS will do to a novice driver? Just a terrible thing to do. But glancing at it to get your directions, a little bit of visual distraction, you're glancing down. Your mind could be pretty heavily involved in that though, so just keep that in mind. Next slide. Talking on a hands-free device, that could involve a large part of your thought process. You're kind of picturing the person you're talking to, a little bit more than talking to a passenger, but at least your hands are on the wheel. Next slide. So when we get down to texting and programming a GPS, it's a heavy visual component, a heavy manual component, and a heavy cognitive component. So all 3 of those are playing all at once, taking full focus away from the road. One thing that's pretty important to mention is that, there's people that claim that they can multitask. Multitasking is not a thing. The human brain cannot multitask. I know that a lot of you watching this are saying, well, I can do it. What you're probably actually doing is moving very quickly back and forth between 2 tasks. And that's very different from multitasking, which implies that you're focusing on 2 things simultaneously. When you're doing one thing, you are not doing the other. So if you are texting, if you're talking on a hands-free phone, you're not driving. So that's very important. And there's some research that says that there's a time period between switching back and forth between 2 tasks where you kind of diminish your ability to do either task. So there's a time period when you're switching from texting back to driving where you're doing both things pretty poorly, or at least your reaction times are slower. Next slide. So as you can see, there's a lot of things that form to create different levels of distraction. Next slide. And there's a continuum of distraction. So some things, talking to a passenger, probably not horribly distracting, down to texting, which is quite distracting. Next slide, please. So one of the problems is that we probably come to think that distraction has reached a peak, but it probably has not. This is a slide looking at the number of households that are cell phone only households. And I just picked 5 states completely randomly to throw into this slide. And this is the percentage of households over the last 5 years, and what percent of them are cell phone only households. Next slide. And as you can see that there's pretty big increases in those percentages over the past 5 years. Connecticut, huge increase, 53% more. Rhode Island, while it's a smaller increase, the rate of number of households that are cell phone only is incredibly high. What does that mean? That means whereas 5 years ago, we had some level of cell phone calls versus household calls following us into the vehicle. Now for a lot more people, 100% of their communications are following them into the vehicles. And if you look at data related to number of texts sent, data usage, all those things are still continuing to grow. And it's safe to assume that at least some of those activities are occurring while people drive. Next slide. So the question is, next slide, who is driving distracted? So we know for seatbelts, who doesn't wear their seatbelts, that it tends to be men ages 17 to 34. Next slide. For alcohol usage, who's drinking and driving? Again, men ages 21 to 40 or 50 years old. When we get to distraction though, next slide, it tends to be pretty much everybody under 70 years old. Everybody is driving distracted. So it clearly is more younger people are driving distracted than the older people, but it's pretty much everybody. And a recent study we did actually showed that even those that are observers judged to be 60 and over have increased over the last 2 or 3 years. They doubled the numbers that we're observing driving distracted. So the everyone under 70 may soon be just everybody. Next slide. So when we look at this was our most recent observational study done in Connecticut. We did 2 rounds of observation, one in March of this year and one in May of this year. And we looked at the rate of distraction by people who we judged to be 16 to 20 and those that we judged to be 20 to 59. And the numbers for the 60 and over were relatively small, so I left them out. And you can see if we're talking about handheld, so phone to the ear, talking on it, everybody's pretty much the same. They're both 2%, not much different between younger people and older people. And handheld cell phone use is something that has decreased quite a bit in Connecticut over the years. Next slide. If we look at texting behavior, however, those are pretty large numbers. And I know folks are saying, well, 8%, 5%, those are small numbers. It seems like everybody's doing it. The overall number across all kinds of distracted driving, including the phone to the ear, is about 10% of motorists in Connecticut. It's higher elsewhere. But that's a really large number in terms of what it does to crash risk. And you can see that our youngest drivers are doing it a lot more than the older drivers. I also broke it down by whether the drivers were male or female. Next slide. And you can see that both young males and younger people, regardless of sex, tend to text more than older people. So the light ones are older people. Older male occupants tend to text more in this study. And I say in this study because we did this during rush hour times. So that may be both morning and afternoon rush hour. So that may be driving the sex differences we see here. Other states, we don't always see the same sex difference. And even in Connecticut, other observations didn't show it. But we almost always show the youngest drivers texting a lot more than the older drivers. Now, some of you may say, whoa, you did this study this year in March and May. There's a huge difference between what's going on in March than what was going on in Connecticut in May. So just out of curiosity, I split it up, next slide, to look at pre-pandemic texting and driving and post-pandemic texting and driving. So the interesting thing is that across the board, drivers tend to be texting and driving a little less under pandemic conditions. And surprisingly, we had the same number of observations in the same amount of time. So there was a little bit of reopening happening in May when we did these. But interestingly enough, we found that young male drivers actually increased their texting and driving under the pandemic situation, where everybody else was decreasing it. So watch your young boys probably a little closer. And that's all I've got for you. Last slide. If you have questions, I think we'll be taking those at the end after Karen has spoken. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Neil. That was excellent presentation, really informative, and I think really gives us a good baseline. And now I want to introduce Karen Torres, who's been a safety advocate for distracted driving and slow down, move over laws throughout New York State in particular. But she's certainly done presentations that have had impact nationally. So we want to introduce Karen, and I'll let her take it away.
Thank you so much, Alec. Neil, that was great too. Thank you so much for all that information. I do want to first start by thanking, of course, AAA Northeast for inviting me to come and speak today. Want to thank the New York State Governor's Traffic Safety Committee and SAD National. We have a grant through SAD that allows us to go and speak at high schools throughout New York State, sharing this important message. Distracted driving is something that I hold very close to my heart. If you could actually put up the first picture, Alec, that would be great. I'd like to share a story before I start about the cement truck. Do you have it up there? There it is. So I have a story to share. The driver of the cement truck was out in Eastern Long Island. He had just finished his delivery and he was heading back to his employer. He had gotten onto Sunrise Highway, and as he was driving, he came upon a work zone that was being led by the New York State Department of Transportation. There was a crew of guys out there filling in potholes, so they had the right lane closed off, and they had arrow boards directing everyone to merge to the left. Well, as he was merging, not only was he speeding, he was just drinking a bottle of water, and the bottle of water had slipped from his hands. So he reached down to pick it up, but when he reached down to pick it up, not only did he take his eyes off the road, but he pulled the steering wheel down with him. And by the time he looked back up, he had crossed over those closed lanes and he slammed to the work zone. And that's where he hit and killed a worker. And that worker was my father, Patrick Mapleson. And I go around, I share my dad's story because I don't want anyone to have to do what I do because they lost someone to something that was so preventable. My dad's birthday was just the day before. He had just turned 66. He was getting ready to retire in 7 months. 7 months. When I went back to his house after I left the hospital, all of his paperwork was sitting on the table. And I had called him the night before to wish him a happy birthday. And we made plans for him to come over that Sunday to celebrate. And the last thing he said to me was, "I'll see you Sunday, sweetheart." And the next morning I got up. It was a Friday, St. Patrick's Day. And I went and got everything for dinner. He told me what he wanted. I picked up his birthday cake. And when I came home, I had gotten that phone call from the dispatcher of the DOT telling me I needed to get to the hospital, that my dad was just hit by a truck. And of course, I can't even explain how I felt. I mean, I was screaming, like, what do you mean? Is he hurt? Is he dead? Is he in a coma? What happened? And the man just said, "Karen, I don't know, and you have to get to the hospital." You know, I always say, thank God my husband was home that day, and because I don't know, I would never have been able to drive there. And when we got to the hospital, we pulled into the emergency room, and I saw the ambulance and 3 Suffolk County police cars, and my heart sank. And as I walked in, there was a nurse already waiting for me, and she said, "Are you Patrick's daughter?" And I said, "Yes." And she put her arm around me, and forget, I just knew then. And I just started screaming, "Oh my God, my father's dead. My father's dead." You know, like, you don't ever think that something like this would happen to you. You know, my dad was just at work, you know, filling in potholes. And a man who was just did something that he thought was so innocent, reaching over and taking his eyes off the road for a split second. didn't know that how many lives that had destroyed that one day. This man was not a young, inexperienced driver. He was a retired New York City fireman. He spent his entire career saving lives. And that one bad choice he made, he killed someone. You know, it's not about how long we've been driving. It's not about, you know, how great of drivers and safe we think we are. It's about those seconds that we choose to take our eyes off the road to do something else. That is truly what matters, right? You know, Alec, you said in the beginning that it's more of do as I say, not as I do. I mean, do as I say, yeah, not as I do. You know, from the second our kids are born, the second they're born, we want to keep them safe, protect them. We teach them right from wrong. Don't run into the street. You got to look both ways. Don't play with fire. Don't go near the pool. So when we're driving, why would that be any different? It starts at home. It starts at home. You know, if you as a parent are using your phone when you're driving, how can you ever expect your kids not to? And it's not just about texting. These kids, what they're doing now is they're snapping. Everything's about Snapchat. You know, when you say texting, they really truly think it's just actually texting someone. My 16-year-old daughter, her Snapchat score is over 1 million. You know, which if you don't know what that means, their score determines how many pictures they send or receive. My daughter has had the app for 4 years. Her score is over 1 million. It's insane. It's insane. But this is what these kids are doing. They don't think twice. You know, that Snapchat or maybe doing a TikTok video is going to cause a crash. It's just it's sad. It's really sad. Getting back to my dad, the driver that had killed him, he did not go to jail. He was given a 90-day license suspension. I was handed an urn with ashes, and he was given a 90-day license suspension. But he did tell me that the first person he sees when he wakes up is my dad, and the last person he sees before he goes to bed is my dad. So this is where that, you know, this is where that jail sentence is, because when you kill someone, that's it. You are stuck with that forever. That pain, it doesn't go away, not for him, not for the family, not for the coworkers, not for anyone. It trickles down to so many, the holes in the hearts that are left behind. It's just so sad, especially just knowing that it's 100% preventable. You can get an app, you know, you could download one of those apps. My oldest daughter, she uses the Do Not Disturb, which is great. It shuts all of her notifications off when she starts to drive. She'll spend maybe 10 minutes in the driveway when she gets back home, but they're great to have. If you don't hear it, you don't feel it, you don't see it, you don't have to worry about it, because how far do we drive that it truly can't wait? There's really nowhere that's that important that you truly have to look at your phone, answer your phone. I don't care that you're at a stoplight. You know, eventually it's going to turn green, right? As parents, again, you need to be on top of your kids. You have to be on top of your kids. They have apps that you can look at about their driving. I know, I believe it's Toyota. I'm sorry, no, I think it's Ford. My friend just gotten her daughter, his daughter, a Ford, and they can see how fast she was driving. They can set the control of how loud the volume is on her radio. These are all great things to have. We have to be in control, or things are just going to keep getting out of control. It's never going to end. So that's really it for me. You know, it's just like I said, it's a subject that I hold close to my heart. I travel all over speaking to high school students, and it's not just the students, it's really the adults that really also need the education behind it. Because, you know, I'm just a girl who really just loved her dad, and I don't want my dad to just be that little statistic, you know, that he died on the highway. He died for some reason, and that's for me to go and save a life. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share his story. I really do appreciate it.
Well, no, thank you so much, Karen. I mean, that's just, it's so moving. You know, I've heard you speak before, and I've heard you speak now, and every time, you know, your love for your father and your passion for wanting to make sure that no one else has to suffer that same fate is just really remarkable. And we thank you for what you did today and what you've been doing. I want to introduce my my colleague and co-moderator, Diana Amandi, who is joining us by phone, having a little bit of technical difficulty with the camera, but she's going to ask a few questions for our panelists. And And for the audience, please feel free to submit some questions, and we'll get to those towards the end. So Diane, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks so much, Alec. And I am so sad that I can't see you all today. Yeah, technically, we always have a plan B at AAA, but I wish I could have joined, visually as well. But Karen, so much of what you just discussed hit home. I'm the senior manager of public affairs here at AAA Northeast, and I got my start at the club 13 years ago as a traffic safety educator. So I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of teen drivers myself, but most importantly, I'm the mom of a teen driver. And there is no sweeter sound in my life than my son's car pulling into the driveway every night when he gets home. And I think, him growing up and doing what I do and kind of being entrenched in the data and the research, I was probably a lot more anxiety ridden than the average parent. But Karen, my first question is for you. I know that, Governor Cuomo has included you in press conferences on this issue, which is such a great compliment to you and your work. When you speak, though, to adult audiences, because I know you have this wonderful program for high school students called All For You, Dad. But when you speak to the parents, what's your key message for them?
It's the same, like I had just said, it all starts at home. And I do talk about it's not do as I say, not as I do. And what's really scary, and I do say this in my presentations, I always ask every student, how many of your parents use their phone when they're driving besides Bluetooth? And I will tell you at least 95% of the kids raise their hand. And that's so sad. 95%. And I tell them that. It's like they just don't. Teens will tell me that their parent, if they say put it down or give me the phone and I'll text for you or do whatever you need to do, they'll say, no, I got this. I've never crashed before. I'm better at this. I've been driving for 30 years. And again, it doesn't matter because it just takes that 1 second. It doesn't matter if you're 16 or if you're 66. That 1 second, it can change a life forever. So my message really
Absolutely.
it starts at home. You have to follow through. Don't use your phone when you're driving. These kids are just going to keep doing it.
Absolutely. I know last week's teen safety webinar, we had Pam Fisher on from the Governor's Highway Safety Association, and she really emphasized, we're talking about graduated driver's licensing, just the importance of parent-teen contracts. We have those available at AAA as well, and I think it's a must-have on it, to have a parent-teen contract and to hold the parents accountable for those same behaviors. I know when I used to teach, I would actually hand out a parent report card to the kids, have them score their parents right there in front of them, and then turn that report card over. And lots of interesting conversations. So I cannot agree with you more. Yeah. So thank you for calling them out. Do you know how many students you've reached so far, or approximately how many, Karen?
Well, I've been speaking for 11 years. So I have spoken to well over 200,000, I would guess. It has to be. I do an average of like between 15,000 and 20,000 or so a year. And that's
wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I love my job. I've never been so fulfilled. It's just because I'm honoring my dad. Like I can't. I hated public speaking. My friends still can't believe I do this for a living, but because I hated it. But when you believe in something and you believe in change, and if you can just change one person, that's that one person that's going to pay it forward. And maybe that teen's not going to be afraid to speak up to their friend and say, hey, you can't use your phone when you're driving. You could kill me. Like I always say, if you knew getting into that car, you were about to drive to your death, would you get in that car? Of course not. So why are we allowing other people to choose your fate? Because you're too afraid to say something? It can't be. It can't
Absolutely.
be. We have to teach them to speak up. They shouldn't be afraid. Shouldn't be afraid. But thank you, Diana.
Absolutely. I always say that the young people are the most powerful advocates because they can create the social norms within their peer group and get out there and state what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I can't agree with you more. Thank you. And so would you say, I know this is a hard question for you, Karen, what feedback have you received that's really kept you going?
Oh my gosh.
Besides the love that you have for your dad, which is so evident, and we can all feel that, but do you remember any particular feedback that has really driven you to keep going?
Every presentation, there are times that it's really hard. Like I'll actually just break down in front of 500 kids. You know, sometimes I forget that I'm talking about my dad. And every student or any student that comes over to me at the end and just says, "Can I have a hug?" I always say that my dad, I really truly feel that my dad sends me little angels to help me keep going. And I always say, "You're my angel today, so thank you for that." Because just that,
I believe that.
Thank you. I'm going to say something now. Or if I meet someone and, you know, 2 years ago, and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, I remember you. You spoke at my school." I'm like, "Oh my God, you remember me?" You know, like you
Right.
you don't want to be that one presentation that it's just, you forget about it when you walk out of the, you know, but any student that comes over to me, that's what helps me keep going, because I know I did my job. And when you can silence a room of 500 kids, you know you're doing a really good job. Because it's not an easy task, but that room is like, it's a pin drop. So it makes
Takes a lot of energy.
It really does. And I love it. I love it. So that's really what
And we've seen so many images of you, Karen, speaking to huge auditoriums, you know, of students in these huge groups. So I know it's a little different in the middle of a pandemic, but that's why we're so grateful that you can be with us on this webinar and keep the message going. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Yeah, no, thank you. And actually, Dr. Chadri, I have a question for you as well, or maybe two questions, because we actually have a good number of driver ed classroom teachers and behind the wheel instructors on the webinar with us today. So I know that, you know, sitting in on a driver ed class, a lot of the content is very focused on the mechanics of driving and the laws and physics. But with your background and expertise, what advice would you have for the teachers that are listening in about educating young people from the behavioral perspective?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And I think one of the important things is what Karen's presentation actually did for me. And I need to hear presentations like that frequently to remind me that the numbers I deal with aren't numbers, they're people.
Right.
And I think that message is very important to young people, for them to know that, you know, when we're talking about safety, it's not this abstract thing. We're talking about human lives. We're talking about the lives of their friends who are riding with them. And maybe something like that. And I'm speaking from, you know, there's not data suggesting that this is effective, but it seems reasonable to me that when we get out of the abstract and into the real world and, you know, explain, can you imagine your best friend sitting in the car next to you, you're texting, and they're dead. That's a real thing. That has happened to people. And, you know, the other thing is it may not even be their friend. It could be an innocent person on the road. It could be the mother of a young child. You know, I think it has to be phrased in terms of who could be impacted by answering a text.
Right.
And I just wanted to mention something. Karen said very, very nicely that 1 second, is it worth it? The dangers that can happen in that 1 second, but it's not 1 second. It tends to be 3 seconds on average. That's how long people are manipulating a phone. I use the term texting, but it could be doing anything. It's 3 seconds. That's a football field with your eyes closed. I think kids have to recognize that it's not just brief times. When they're glancing back up at the road after 3 seconds down, they're not even processing the road before they're back down. So it's more than a football field. They're driving with their eyes closed.
Absolutely. In that time that it takes to snap, TikTok, tweet, post on Instagram, probably more than 3 seconds in many cases for, the social media users while driving as well. And to your point, last year NHTSA reported almost 2,900 deaths directly attributed to distracted driving. And it is something that's very difficult to wrap our minds around, that 2,900 people with friends and family members who loved them were lost to something so preventable. So
and that could be underreported.
I think that's correct.
Yes.
Yeah, right, which I think we all believe. But let's face it, I think we're all living in a very selfish society, and parents tend to, when they talk to their teens about distracted driving, it's, I don't want you to get hurt. I don't want you to get in a crash. I don't want you to get killed. And it's not, I don't want you to hurt someone else. Which I think we have to, as educators, all kind of be mindful of. Exactly what you said, Dr. Chaudhary, thank you. And is there, looking at all the data that you're able to analyze, is there one message that you think is missing, or that the media is missing in talking on this issue, especially to parents?
Well, if we're talking to parents, I think Karen again hit it right on the nail. It's kids model behavior to some extent. And I know I've driving around my own town, I've seen friends of mine texting with their kids in the back seat. And that's pretty scary. When parents say, do as I say, not as I do, that's not as effective as them doing the right thing. And I think modeling behavior is pretty important. Let's see. I took some notes here. And something else that's pretty important is parents oftentimes tell their kids don't text and drive, and then they're texting their kids while their kids are driving.
Yes.
That's another thing that's pretty important. Because parents, just like kids, we all want that instant feedback. You text a kid, you want to know where they are immediately. You have to allow that, if they're driving, if they're on their way home, they shouldn't be contacting you, and they shouldn't be texting at stoplights. There's apps that can tell when vehicles are moving based on the phone, and parents should be very aware of when they're texting their kids. So I am not aware, however, of any specific messaging that is more effective than any other. I'd be happy to hear about it, though.
But your point about the technology, it's so true. There's this one great feature that we should all be using, which is the do not disturb when your vehicle is in motion, right? It's so easy. Everyone that has an iPhone can just turn that on. It automatically sends a text to whoever is trying to contact you to let them know that you're driving and you're on the road. So I think that's a must-have for everybody. And as the mom of a teen driver, I will tell you that I am looking at his GPS location through my happy little app probably 50 times a night. So again, cannot agree more. From here, I think I'm going to turn it over back to Alec for some questions from our audience, but thank you both so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Wonderful job. Thanks.
Thanks, Diana. And one question that we have, and both of you touched on it a little bit, is how do we raise the profile of the distractions that are not texting and not using the phone? Things like reaching for a water bottle or using a navigation system or an infotainment system. It seems like when we think about distraction, we're thinking about texting, and that's what's drilled into people's minds when you look at PSAs and ads, and rightfully so. But how do we raise the profile of those other types of distractions? And this is for both of you.
Right. For me, honestly, it takes a conscious effort every time you get behind the wheel to make sure that you're not distracted. you have to be in the moment all the time. And it's very easy. I mean, I've been on the expressway and I've missed my exit because I'm thinking about something, right? And I mean, that's happened to other people. It takes a conscious effort every single time. And it's hard to really be in the moment 100% of the time, but that's why you try to teach them this at a young age so that they're already doing it when they're getting, to our age. I've been driving over 30 years, right? So, but there's things that I'm not a perfect driver. I can't tell you that, but I know that when things fall, I do know not to look. I have people now that I've seen my presentation or friends, they'll say, you know what, Karen, like my watch became unclipped and it fell. And my first thought came to you and was like, oh, I can't touch it until until I'm stopped. So I think it's just a matter of just thinking about making an effort to the conscious effort every time. That's for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think based on the earlier question, that's something that could and should come in and probably already does to some extent with the driver training period by professional teachers, but also should come into play with parents. The infotainment system, that was, I was very serious when I said I got a vehicle that had this fancy thing. I was, even though I've been doing this for years and I'm hyper aware of distracted driving, I was quite excited to have a vehicle where I could communicate and do all these things safely. And about 4 seconds into it, I'm like, this is not safe. So I think that's something that the kids need to be aware of, that just because it came with the vehicle doesn't mean it's safe. Eating, drinking, there's so much we do, listening to the radio. I say it in usually every one of these presentations. I may have missed it this time, but anything you do that is not driving is distracting to some extent. And kids need to be aware of that. There's some things that are likely more and less, some things that are unavoidable. But let's save the risk for the unavoidable things. The things we can avoid, let's avoid them. Let's focus on driving. And especially the 16, 17-year-olds, they might be less likely to engage in these behaviors because they are a little bit more nervous, but there's that handful that are like, I'm behind the wheel, I'm set free, as soon as I can drive alone, the gloves are off, I'm gonna do it, and they're not equipped to do it. None of us are. And I really like the data that says we cannot multitask. A lot of people say that's not true. We can, I know I can do it fabulously. It just isn't true. We can, go back and forth between things, but when we're focusing on one thing, we are not focusing on something else. And I think that's an all-encompassing piece of information that folks need to know about.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Neil and Karen. And one last question has to do with, I guess, the message that kids are getting from the media, perhaps. And I don't mean the media as in the news media. I just mean things that they consume, television shows, they're influencers on Instagram or TikTok. I think I'm relatively young, and even using that term influencer makes me gag a little bit. But a lot of that shows people engaging in distracting behaviors like it's no problem. And of course, we know kids are influenced by their peers' opinions as well. What is or the most, or even just one effective tactic to try to counteract that potential influence?
That's such a hard one because it's so hard. I was just, every time I watch a show, but even yesterday I was watching a show and one of the girls FaceTimed her mom and her mom was driving. She picked it up. I'm like, it's a reality TV show. I'm like, oh my gosh, like how is it that the producers, they're allowing her to answer her phone on FaceTime? Like that blows my mind. And I don't know how to stop it. It's everywhere. And I am just shocked because, they say that texting and driving, you know, is worse than driving drunk. Sorry, I'm fumbling, but it just blows my mind that, you know, you would never show you know, a TV or reality star, let's say, you know, drinking and driving. They're not going to allow that on the show. So why are you allowing them to use their phone? I don't know how to stop that. I don't know.
Yeah, and Karen, that was exactly what I was going to use as an example. It's the social acceptability of the behavior. Right now, it is still socially acceptable to text and drive and talk on your phone and drive. It's no longer socially acceptable to get a DUI. People don't brag about DUIs. I mean, that used to be something people were like, yeah, I got a DUI, who cares? MAD did a wonderful thing by demonizing the DUI, and I think that reduced the behavior. How do we demonize texting and driving, or other activities that are killing folks? That's the question. You know, I didn't answer the question, Alec. I just posed it in a different way. How do we demonize it? How do we make it less socially acceptable? In other presentations I show this this advertisement of the Little Tykes vehicle, where the little kid inside the Little Tykes car has a phone to her ear. I would hope that's not out there anymore. I mean, it's an old advertisement, and I'm hoping, you know, that there's some social responsibility. Obviously, it's not making its way to reality television at all, but that's what has to happen, and I don't know how to make that happen.
Yeah. Well, that's I guess the challenge for all of us, and I know we're just about out of time, and I hate to end there because I know that really poses the challenge to us, but I think it's you know, incumbent upon us that work in the field, and certainly I hope the folks that are listening to this webinar to at least be the change in your households and your social networks, your communities, to advocate, to raise awareness of this issue and make it something that is just socially unacceptable. So I think that's the work that we all have to do. But I want to thank you, Neil, and you, Karen, for two great presentations and a really insightful conversation. I think everyone, I know I enjoyed it. I don't want to speak for everyone, but I think everyone really appreciated it. Certainly at AAA, we're very appreciative of both your time. So I want to thank you. And with that, I just want to let the audience know we have a few more in our teen driving series. We have one next Tuesday on impaired driving, followed by ones on drowsiness, driving with ADHD. And then we're going to have a session where we hear from teens directly about their experiences. So with that, I'll wish everyone a good afternoon and a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.